August 1945. 6 American soldiers were waist deep in a lagoon, trying to cross 30 yards of open water, while Japanese riflemen worked the shoreline from both sides. 30 yards. That was all that stood between them and the PT boat. It might as well have been an ocean. Bullets were cutting the surface around their chests. Palm trunks were splintering behind them. The jungle line flashed orange every time another Japanese rifle fired. Any normal commander, reading the numbers afterward, would have written the ending before it happened. 200 Japanese soldiers, 6 Americans, no cover, no high ground, no second boat coming. And then one of the 6 men planted his feet in the water, raised a Browning automatic rifle from the hip, and started firing like he had all the time in the world. Not panic fire, not a desperate spray into the trees. Controlled bursts, short, cold, measured. Another scout swept the left flank with a grease gun. 2 more stood upright in the open, deliberately pulling fire toward themselves so the others could move. They were not supposed to survive that. Then the sky opened. An Australian boomerang fighter dropped so low over the beach that the palms shook in its wake. Machine guns ripped through the tree line. Behind the scouts, the PT boats answered with heavier fire. For a few seconds, the island disappeared into smoke, torn leaves, and flying sand. When the firing stopped, all 6 Americans climbed aboard the boat. Not one of them had been hit. A few nights later, Radio Tokyo told its listeners that Imperial troops had repelled an Allied raid with heavy American losses. That was the part Japan got wrong. There had been losses. They were all on the Japanese side. The 6 men belonged to a unit the Japanese army never fully identified, never penetrated, and never captured. Across the war, no member of that unit was killed in action. No member was taken prisoner. No body was left behind, not one. They were called the Alamo Scouts, and the most dangerous thing about them was not that they could fight. It was that, most of the time, the enemy never knew they had been there at all. To understand how 6 men could walk into a trap built for 200 and come back clean, you have to start with a different kind of disaster, not a firefight, a landing. In 1943, the United States was moving across the Pacific one island at a time. Every amphibious landing depended on intelligence gathered before the first landing craft hit the beach. Where were the guns? How many troops were waiting? Was the beach mined? Was the enemy still there? Those were not staff questions. They were life or death questions. And too often, the answers were late, incomplete, or simply wrong. Kiska was the lesson nobody could ignore. Thousands of Allied troops stormed an island in the Aleutians after a full invasion buildup, only to find that the Japanese had already evacuated. Men still died there, not because the enemy held the beach, but because confusion, fog, and bad intelligence turned an empty island into a killing ground. For Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, that was intolerable. Kruger commanded 6th Army in the Southwest Pacific. He was not interested in brave guesses. He wanted eyes on the ground before he committed thousands of men to surf, sand, and enemy machine guns. And he had learned something ugly. The existing intelligence system did not move at the speed of battle. Reports traveled through the wrong channels. Naval scouts returned late. Debriefings stalled. Commanders were forced to plan landings with too many blank spaces on the map. So Kruger made a decision that looked small on paper and radical in practice. On November 28, 1943, he created his own reconnaissance force. Not a battalion, not a regiment. Small teams, 6 or 7 men, inserted by PT boat, submarine or flying boat, sent ahead of the invasion force, ordered to vanish behind Japanese lines, count what mattered, and report directly back to 6th Army. No parade name, no public identity, no safety net. Their training center was built on Ferguson Island off New Guinea, a humid strip of jungle where the course was designed to break anyone who could not think clearly, while tired, hungry, wet, and afraid. The trainees learned rubber boat work in heavy surf, jungle navigation, demolitions, radio operation, hand-to-hand fighting, beach reconnaissance, silent movement through terrain where one snapped branch could bring an entire patrol down on them. But the real test was not strength. It was judgment. A man could be brave and still be useless to Kruger. A man could be decorated and still talk too loudly, move too fast, panic too early, or carry too much pride into a mission where pride got people killed. The Alamo Scouts needed a different kind of soldier, one who could lie in mud for hours and not move, one who could hold a radio aerial in the dark with insects crawling over his neck, one who could watch an enemy patrol pass close enough to smell and still not breathe too hard. And then came the strangest part of the selection process. After training, the men secretly listed who they trusted enough to deploy beside them, officers and enlisted men both. That meant a team was not just assigned. It was chosen by the men who might die inside it. Trust was not a slogan in the Alamo Scouts. Trust was equipment. The first proof came in February 1944 on Los Negros Island in the Admiralties. Planners believed the Japanese might have abandoned the area. If that was true, an American landing could move fast. If it was wrong, thousands of men might be thrown into a fortified trap. Lieutenant John McGowan's 6-man team went in first. They came ashore in darkness from a PBY flying boat, dragged their rubber boat through the surf, and disappeared into the island. The team crawled close enough to Japanese positions to hear men moving in the dark, close enough that one careless cough could have ended the mission. Then they radioed the truth. The Japanese had not left. They were waiting. That single message shifted the landing plan. Instead of striking where the enemy was strongest, the invasion force moved toward a weaker approach. That is what Kruger had wanted from the beginning. Not glory, not headlines. A few accurate words from 6 men hidden in the jungle, delivered early enough to save hundreds of lives. From that point on, the Alamo Scouts became the thing Japanese commanders could feel but not understand. Before landings in New Guinea and the Philippines, tiny American teams appeared near beaches, airstrips, trails, and coastal guns. They counted men, they sketched defenses, they watched supply roads, they marked patrol routes, then they disappeared. Japanese intelligence could not build a clean picture because the evidence never stayed behind. No captured scout, no dead scout, no radio set recovered, no uniformed body in the brush. Just American assaults that seemed to know too much, and that was the point. By late 1944, scouts had proved they could gather intelligence behind enemy lines. But the war was changing. The closer American forces came to the Philippines, the more urgent another problem became. Prisoners. Allied prisoners, civilians, and survivors of the Bataan Death March were still behind Japanese lines. Many had been starving for years. Many were too sick to march, and as Japanese units retreated, there was reason to fear that camps would not be abandoned peacefully. Palawan gave that fear a face. In December 1944, Japanese guards murdered American prisoners, rather than let them be liberated. When reports reached 6th Army, they did not read like an exception. They read like a warning. Near Cabanatuan, on Luzon, more than 500 Allied prisoners were still alive. Inside a camp the Japanese could destroy before American forces arrived. The men inside had survived starvation, disease, forced labor, beatings, and the long shadow of Bataan. Some families back home had not heard from them in years. 6th Army needed a rescue, but a rescue force could not simply charge the gate. The camp sat in open country. Rice fields surrounded it. Guard towers looked across flat ground. The approaches were exposed. Machine guns covered the likely routes. If the Rangers went in blind, the prisoners could be killed before help reached them. So Kruger sent the Alamo Scouts. Lieutenant William Bill Nellist looked at the aerial photographs and understood the problem immediately. There was no jungle to hide in, no ravine, no thick brush, no safe way for uniformed soldiers to crawl close enough to count the guns. So, Nellist and Private First Class Rufo Vacalar did the only thing that made sense. They stopped looking like soldiers. They put on straw hats and Filipino farmers' clothes. No visible weapons, no military gear, no movement that looked urgent. Just two men walking in daylight through country where a single suspicious glance could have ended the entire rescue. They reached an abandoned shack within a few hundred yards of the prison camp and went inside. From there they could see the gate. They could see the towers. They could see guards moving. And for roughly 2 hours, while Japanese soldiers passed nearby, Nellist and Vacalar watched. They counted guard changes, marked machine gun positions, studied the road, noted the angles that might hide an assault force until the last possible moment. Aerial photographs became maps of life and death under their pencils. Tiny marks, small enough to hide, important enough to decide whether 500 prisoners would live until morning. That is not courage in the loud way most people imagine it. That is colder. That is discipline wrapped around fear so tightly that fear becomes useful. When the marked report reached Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci and the 6th Ranger Battalion, the plan took shape. Rangers would strike the camp. Filipino guerrillas would block Japanese reinforcements and control the roads. A P-61 Black Widow night fighter would roar over the camp at the critical moment to pull Japanese eyes upward. Everything depended on timing. Everything depended on the camp being exactly as the scouts had reported. On January 30, 1945, the raid went in. The Black Widow skimmed over the camp. Guards looked up. The Rangers crossed the open ground. Then the first shots broke the night. The assault was violent and fast. In less than half an hour, the camp's defenses were broken. Japanese guards were killed or driven back. Filipino guerrillas held the roads against reaction forces. Rangers moved through the barracks, some of them finding men so weak they had to be carried. The prisoners did not all understand what was happening at first. Some thought it was a Japanese trick. Some could barely stand. Some had spent so long waiting to die that rescue felt less believable than execution. Then they saw Americans at the door. 516 Allied prisoners came out alive. Many had been captive since 1942. Nearly 3 years of hunger, sickness, and silence ended because a rescue force hit the right gate, from the right angle, at the right minute. And that happened because 2 Alamo Scouts had sat in a shack, dressed as farmers, and counted the camp while the enemy looked straight past them. After Cabanatuan, The Alamo Scouts could not remain completely invisible. The raid was too large. The rescue was too important. Newspapers began reporting that a small, secret reconnaissance unit had helped make it possible. The details were still censored, but the outline leaked into public view. A hidden unit existed. It had been working across the Pacific, and its record sounded impossible. Over the course of the war, the Alamo Scouts were credited with 106 known missions behind enemy lines. 1,482 combined days in the field. 84 Japanese prisoners captured for interrogation. Hundreds of Allied prisoners and civilians liberated. More than 100 decorations. And the number that still stops people cold. 0 killed in action. 0 captured. 0. That number is not a miracle. Miracles do not hold for 106 missions. Luck does not last through jungle insertions, PT boat extractions, coastal patrols, rice fields, prisoner rescues, and islands filled with men ordered to kill anything that moved. 0 was a system, selection, training, trust, restraint, the discipline to avoid a fight when the mission was information, the violence to end a fight quickly when contact became unavoidable, the humility to understand that 6 men did not beat an army by acting large. They beat it by staying small. The Japanese adapted too late. After Cabanatuan, garrisons grew more suspicious. Patrols tightened. Civilians near military zones were watched with harsher eyes. Some commanders began to understand that small American teams were appearing before landings. But they still did not understand the whole shape of the threat. They saw fragments. A reported patrol near a beach, a sighting of men near a trail, a defensive position that was bombarded with impossible accuracy days later. They knew something was happening. They could not catch the men doing it. By early 1945, the Scouts were operating across the Philippines under pressure that would have crushed a larger, louder unit. Teams went in with radios, carbines, grenades, rations, and the knowledge that no one could rescue them if the island closed around them. On one mission, a patrol passed close enough in the dark that the Scouts could have reached out and touched a boot. No one fired, no one whispered. They let the enemy pass. That kind of survival does not come from bravery alone. Bravery makes noise. Discipline stays silent. As the war neared its end, the Scouts were already being considered for what might have been their most dangerous assignment: reconnaissance ahead of an invasion of the Japanese home islands. That mission never came. Japan surrendered in August 1945. The formal surrender was signed in September, and in November, in Kyoto, the Alamo Scouts were disbanded with almost no public ceremony. No national myth formed around them. No victory parade carried their name. Many went home to ordinary lives with extraordinary memories they could barely explain. The unit had been secret in war. It remained half hidden in peace. But what Kruger built did not disappear. The methods lived on. Small team reconnaissance, peer trust, selection under pressure, men trained to operate far ahead of conventional forces, not as raiders first, but as eyes, ears, and judgment in places commanders could not see. In Korea and Vietnam, long-range patrols carried that inheritance into different jungles and mountains. In the decades after World War II, American Special Operations Forces grew into a permanent institution. And in 1988, surviving Alamo Scouts were brought to Fort Bragg and awarded the Special Forces tab, formally recognizing them as ancestors of the Green Berets. For many of them, recognition came more than 40 years late, but they already knew what they had done. They knew at Los Negros, when 6 men changed an invasion plan from the dark. They knew at Cabanatuan, when starving prisoners walked through a gate that had been mapped from a shack. They knew every time a PT boat engine faded into the black water behind them, and everyone who had gone ashore came back. One of those men, Galen Kittleson, carried the thread farther than almost anyone. He had been a young Iowa farm boy when he joined the Scouts. He was part of the Cabanatuan operation. After the war, he joined Special Forces. In 1970, at age 46, he served on the Sun Tay prison camp raid in North Vietnam, proving that the instincts built in the Pacific had not aged out of him. That is the hidden legacy of the Alamo Scouts. Not just one raid, not just one perfect record. A doctrine built from the idea that the right few men, selected properly and trusted completely, can change the fate of thousands. The Pacific War had battleships, carriers, bombers, divisions, weapons so large they changed the map. But sometimes the campaign turned on something smaller, a rubber boat in black water, a pencil mark on an aerial photograph, a radio message sent from wet jungle, a straw hat worn by a soldier pretending to be a farmer. 6 men moving quietly toward a place the enemy believed no one could reach. The Japanese spent the war trying to identify them. They never really did. That was why the Scouts survived, and that was why they mattered. The most dangerous soldiers in the Pacific were not always the ones the enemy feared. Sometimes they were the ones the enemy only noticed after they were already gone.